All right. Hello, everyone. Happy Friday. Happy Friday the 13th. Wow. I'm just actually realizing that I'm putting two and two together. All right. Okay. Well, it is 6:10, and so I'm going to get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Julia, and I am with Baltimore Racial Justice Action, and I want to welcome you all to our June 13th, our 13th of the month event. We're going to start in a bit. I'm going to have Dana share our slides so we can do some quick reviews before we get started into our conversation. All right. So for our first, we're going to go to some virtual housekeeping. Um, we just want to thank you all once again for coming. Today's event, like a lot of our 13th events, are going to be recorded. They're going to be posted on YouTube. Audiences will you all will not be appearing, but just to let you know, make sure that your name is visible and that your video is on. That's required for tonight. That there was something that was sent out earlier this week. And please make sure you're muting yourself in case you're not speaking. For our next slide, I know just to kind of talk a little bit more about the camera being on, I'm sure a lot of people are used to being online or doing online events. And it can sometimes, people can be there, but they're not necessarily present. So we're asking folks that have their cameras on this evening to kind of build a greater sense of community and connection, to help build trust, as we're having, these topics. So just so you know, but we understand that people are uncomfortable with that, but we're going to ask you all just like to have your cameras on for today. Once again, you will not be on the YouTube video, but just letting you know that your voice might be if you ask a question, or you speak anytime this evening. Next slide. And just a little bit more about what BRJA does. So we were founded in 2003, and we are rooted in the Agents of Change workshops that begin in 1996. We offer free or low-cost public resources like this 13th of the month events and other workshops. And we provide anti-racism, anti-oppression, or ARAO, and organizational development, OD, client consulting in local and national organizations. We work with partners at UMB Center for Restorative Change, on a multi-year project working with social services sector. So this is some of the work that we do. You can learn more about us going on our website. But thank you for coming to our 13th event, because this is actually one of our, I think, fun ones. So welcome to Change is Truth, Octavia Butler, Visionary and Analysis. So I want to get into a little bit about why this topic. Um, Octavia Butler was a legendary author, science fiction writer, Afrofuturist, visionary, and analysis of race, history, and power. And one of the big reasons we're actually doing it this month is because her birthday is June 22nd. And also, we are very big fans of her work. Her work and analysis invite us to really ask deeper questions to better understand ourselves and the world around us. And I think especially in this current social and political climate, Butler is someone who I'm constantly going back to. Her stories, which often center Black characters, provides a critical lens for examining the inequities in our societies, and how they are disproportionately impacting folks who live on the margins. And her work continues, I think, to influence authors and community workers alike, reminding them about the realities that we face, how they might be difficult, but that community, us working together, us asking questions together, us working together, allows us to build a better future for all of us. So a lot of her work, I think, in my opinion, as someone who majored in English and loves to read, I can reread Butler and get something new out of it every time, depending on what's going on in the world. And I've definitely, I think, found that. So Octavia Butler, for me, in a lot of ways, serves as like a North Star for like how do we work together and build a better future for all of us. So in case you aren't familiar with Octavia Butler, just kind of give you an introduction into who she is, a little bit about her. So Octavia Stell Butler, as we mentioned, a pioneering American science fiction author. She's particularly known for blending science fiction, African American spiritualism, and social commentary in her works. She was born in Pasadena, California in 1947. She was raised by her mom and her grandmother. Her father had passed away when she was 7, but her mom and her grandmother had a really big influence on her upbringing and how she saw the world, and really kind of you see that in her writing. She started writing as a teenager, and she was inspired by her childhood love of fantasy, and also the experiences of racial and social inequities that she noticed in growing up. In 1995, she was the first science fiction author to receive the prestigious Mark on MacArthur Fellowship, and she also won multiple Hugo and Nebula Awards for her sci-fi work. She is widely considered a pioneer of science fiction, actually just kind of opening up the genre to incorporate more diverse perspectives and experiences. Unfortunately, even today, I think you still see in science fiction like a very limited kind of analysis and scope of who is included. And when others are included, there's some pushback. There's a lot of debating. I remember when they made a woman like be like the lead in Star Wars, and it was a whole thing. But let alone, like, Octavia was really opening up the genre. And she's often celebrated for her social commentary, her strong female leads, and her ability to imagine compelling and thought-provoking futures. So Octavia, if you have not read some of her work, please do. If you only read a few things, make sure you are looking at the whole scope of her analysis and her stories. She really is someone who is just very special and just fun to read, even though her work can be daunting. Um, I think it is important. I would love to see some folks in the chat if they have read Octavia Butler, which one, like what book or story was your introduction? What is your favorites? And you could put that in the chat just for others to share. Maybe they'll get a chance to read something new. All right. And so for today, I'm really, really excited because anytime I get a chance to talk about books and authors and how it relates to everyday life, I'm very, very happy. It's a good time. It's a good time to spend my time on Friday. So I want to introduce our two panelists for today before we kind of get into some other stuff. But we have Dr. Wendy Shaia, who is the executive director of Center for Restorative Change, and she is the author of The Black Cell. And we have Adar Ayira, the principal consultant of Ayira Core Concepts, LLC, and they're going to be our panelists for today discussing the wonderful Octavia Butler. Okay, I see some folks. Kindred Parable Series, absolutely. So when we first kind of spoke about this event, before we get into our questions, just to kind of center this and ground this into what really kind of brought us, I think, in this space. Octavia Butler, years ago, she was at a book talk, and someone asked her a question about her books essentially predicting the future. How did she know what was going to happen, and what should we do, everyday citizens do, to stop the suffering in the world? And so she answered the question essentially by saying, there is no single answer that will solve all of our future problems. There's no magic bullet. Instead, there are 1,000 of answers, at least. You can be one of them if you choose to be. And so she really kind of expands on this answer in an essay that she put in Essence in 2000 called A Few Rules for Predicting the Future. You can go to the next slide, Dana. And in this essay, there's also a book, you can buy it, small. In this essay, she goes over four, reminders of like how to actually, or rules, how to predict the future. And they are: learn from the past, respect the law of consequences, be aware of your perspectives, and count on the surprises. And so someone was talking about Octavia on, I think, Facebook, and we, were just kind of like discussing it. And I was like, I actually just reread this story, this short essay, because with everything going on, it reminded me that, everything in the world is just kind of happening all over again. And I needed something to kind of just like remind me this is not normal, but is also kind of like normal. That like we have got to be constantly aware of the world that we're in. And so this essay is really, in my opinion, important for all folks to read. It kind of like opens up my mind for what can I do? What can I do for my community? What can I do to keep myself sane? And so that's where this discussion is going to be grounded. So using these four rules, I'm going to welcome Adar and Wendy, and we're going to start our discussion now. So, and the first rule being learn from the past. In this section, she states, writing encourages me to use our past and present behaviors as guides to the kind of world we seem to be creating. And she also said, we forget history at our peril. I'm sure that a lot of folks would also agree with this, but, we have a lot of folks who are ignoring history. So I'm going to have Wendy and Adar come on. And as they kind of introduce themselves, I would also love to hear what their favorite Butler work is. I think right now I'm going to say mine is the Predicting the Future. Just for right now, it changes. And who wants to go first? There they are.
Start us, Wendy.
Okay, great. I knew you were going to do that, Adar. Thank you.
I figured as well. I try to leave it up to y'all, though.
Good evening, everyone. It's really good to be here. I'm Wendy Shaia. I wrote The Black Cell, which is a work of Afrofuturism. Interestingly enough, I started writing the book in 2015, predicting a white nationalist president coming to power in 2024. Really prayed it was purely fiction, but yeah, here we are.
Yep.
And I absolutely love Afrofuturism. Octavia Butler, so interestingly enough, so here's the thing. My favorite book of hers is actually not technically Afrofuturism. I think I'm like a baby chick. I imprint on the first one I read, which was Kindred. But I'm a novelist. And so the excitement for me with Kindred is her skill in across her books in both going from the present into the future and the present into the past. And I'm sure we'll talk some more about that, but I'll stop there and turn it over to Adar.
Okay, thank you. Well, I am really excited. I jumped at the chance to be here today because we're talking about one of my very favorite authors, which is Octavia E. Butler. I am a Octavia E. Butler super fan, and I'm sitting with another of my favorite authors, which is Wendy Shaia, because her book Black Cell, which is centered in Baltimore, is just everything and reminds me of Octavia Butler so much. Although Wendy is Wendy. She's Wendy Shaia. She's her own author, her own individual writer. But what it really reminds me of Octavia, and Wendy, I've said this to you, in terms of the ability that you both as authors have to use historical perspective, to use cultural perspectives, to not only look at another world that can be created, Afrofuturism, but to look at the ways in which Black people, because of white supremacist ideology, because of racism, because of colonization, are not viewed as fully human. in our
Right.
society, and that societies are created with an anti-Blackness and an anti-Black violence, which is so part and parcel of the society that you cannot separate it from it. And that moves us into Afro-pessimism. So
Mhm.
your work really straddles both of those things. And I think in terms of Octavia Butler, it is really important to note that because she is or was one of the first Black women in a sci-fi genre who
Yeah.
really moved beyond that genre and stepped into her own thing where nobody, is particularly no white author in sci-fi, could follow. So she talk about a glass ceiling. She ripped that off and she created her own lane in a
Yes.
whiteness dominated genre. So all
Absolutely.
of those things. And I would be remiss. I also love Lucille Clifton. And so I have to include her too as my all-time favorite.
Okay,
The
all
books
right.
that what I really love, I have her entire collection. So let me just say that her books are like my babies. But I often find that I go back to two books. One is Bloodchild and the other is Kindred. Really love those. And of course, the parables, the
The
two parables.
parable.
Yeah, the
Yes.
parables I think right now are for a lot of people um just very real. They feel
Boy,
very real. I mean,
wow, are
there's
they?
a whole there's actually like I think like a president in there who says like make America great again. It almost feels
Right,
like, which is
Yeah.
why, Butler is usually people say like she was predicting the future, right? And so
Prophetic.
yeah, I mean, and what I love that you brought up, of course, we've talked about Butler being this person who kind of breaks this glass ceiling, and that she essentially like really kind of used her own experiences, her own life to inform her work. And she was very much aware, I think. And so I think, when we were kind of planning this event and like discussing her, we talked about her as a visionary and a historical scholar, right? So not just like an author, but someone who understood history. And she actually centers that in this essay about learning from the past. How do you see storytelling as a form of historical reckoning or repair? And how important is that in this moment, that we're in right now?
Mm. Well, I'm happy to start. I started writing my book during the Freddie Gray uprising, and it was because I was so angry.
Hmm.
And I was furious and I couldn't figure out where to put that anger. And it seemed to me in that moment that in order to make it through that anger, I had to visualize a world where Black people could come together to fight back. By fight back, I don't necessarily mean in violent ways, but come together to build community. Um, to move forward. And it was a way of envisioning it. Look, there are doomsday prophets on every corner. There's a man who stands outside my house on a regular basis, probably about twice a week, with a bullhorn, and he is, discussing the future. Well, what you notice is that everybody walks past him and nobody's really paying attention to anything he says because they can't connect what he's saying to their own lives and their own worlds and what they're seeing around them. But when you begin to put in place characters that feel real and that relate to people and it touches reality, and then you add the message, right, based on
Right.
history, and then you take that into the future. I think you have access to a whole different part of people's psyche and an ability to touch people's emotions that then allows them to connect with that story. And I think that we can write all the history books we want. There are some people who will never read them. And so I think in order to really connect our history to our present and eventually our future, we've got to use every opportunity we can. And I think storytelling is powerful. I come from Jamaica, where we have an oral storytelling tradition. My grandmother didn't read. And so these stories, this ability to sit and listen to a story or read a story is powerful. And I think sometimes we underestimate the power of that narrative and how it can change the way people see the world.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's interesting too, because I know some of my best lessons. I mean, as a humanities person, I learned so much about, of course, not just the reading of literature, but like how do you read it, like in the time that it was written, what was going
That's
on, what
right.
was it
That's right.
inspired by? And what
Mm.
I find is that a lot of people, like when I'm reading this is what I'm doing. But like that's also, I think, a learned behavior. So there's also something I think there about how we have to almost like learn again how to do that. That is not just surface, that we had to kind of like ask grander questions
Yeah.
about the characters that we're reading. If we're not going to read the history book,
Right.
what exactly is going on? So that's really, really awesome. Adar, what about you? What do you think?
Yeah, your question was about the stories being give me those two words again.
Oh, like historical, like reckoning or repair.
Thank you. And you okay, so I don't think that the stories are about repair,
Mm,
because
Mhm.
repair would
Mm.
be people taking these stories and really using them to make some concrete change. And we
Yes.
see in our society where people in power are people who have societal power. I'm not talking about people in power. I'm talking about the everyday citizens who are societally positioned with power as a result of their race, as a result of their gender, as a result of their gender identity, as a result of their ability and not living with disability. I'm talking about all of that. They are not ready to use what they've read to make any change at all that is
Mm.
going to discomfort them, right?
Mhm.
So for them, it still remains as nice stories. Um,
right.
and so maybe the books and the storytelling can seed something, but to get people who are dominant in society in a variety of different ways to move or to even to have increased empathy, and not
Mhm.
empathy in a, oh, my heart is breaking when
Yeah.
I read that, to
Yeah.
make it be about them, but to make it be about the people to whom it is really happening. I don't see that.
Mm,
And Octavia Butler was not a miracle worker. She wasn't a magic Negro. And I remember that for so much of my years and years of joy and pleasure that I took and continue to take in reading her, I would say, "Oh my God, she's a prophet. She's a prophet." I stopped saying that because
mm,
she never wanted to be classified in
That's
that way.
true. She
right.
didn't.
She
You're
says,
right.
I read, I take the lessons of history and I use
Yes.
those lessons in my work. And
Right.
so I was like, oh my gosh, I've been saying she's a prophet. So I have really been magic Negroing Octavia Butler.
Good
And
point.
I do not want to do that anymore. So, yet, do I think she's a prophet? I think that some of her books are prophetic, but
Mhm.
I, have to give her her due for the research, for her imagination, for her rich inner life, all of those things that brought her to the point where she can write these absolutely phenomenal books. But for the repair and everything, I don't think that the ways in which individuals hold dominant societal positions, I don't think that they're ready for that yet. So maybe they're
Mm,
just not ready for everything that they could take from
Yeah.
Octavia Butler's writing.
yeah.
And are
I mean,
ready and maybe not ready and also I think sometimes not willing.
Absolutely
There's I
not
think
willing.
yeah.
it's not all as benign as not being ready, right? Some people are definitely
Exactly.
not willing. I love
Yeah.
this idea of seeding. I think that is a really important word. I remember a young man sent me an email and he said, I thought that all these things that happened that you talked about in your book were made up. He said I had to go on Google and look them up and see, what happened in 1919 and all of these things. And he had just never heard it. He just
Mhm.
never learned. And
Mhm.
and so in many ways, if we can begin the narrative that these are real things that have happened
Right.
because our society is very ahistoric.
Mhm.
Yes. Yes. I think
And
what's interesting, yeah, that reminds me a few years ago, there was a show called Watchmen.
Oh,
And
I
it was
remember
kind
that.
of, and the opening scene of the first episode was
Oh,
about the bombing of Black Wall Street. And I
yes.
remember it was on Twitter before Twitter became what it is now. But people were shocked. There were a lot of people like, well, this is, I remember someone tweeting
Straight
like,
up.
this is, kind of like, this is a lot though. And a lot of like Black folks were like, but this actually happened. And then people started looking it up and they were like, I've never heard about this. And so I think, things when we talk about like storytelling as a form of historical reckoning or repair, that there were people I think who will engage with certain stories, especially like, I think science fiction, and they'll learn something. And then it's kind of like, okay, well, what are you going to do now? Because of course, in my brain, I'm like, if they're lying or you didn't know about this, what else don't you know about? You would hope that would be like the next conclusion, but that's not usually how it works, which is
And
sad.
this is what I love about storytelling, these points that you all are bringing up. Um, Storytelling can be a very subversive form
Mhm.
of
Mhm.
telling history. And
Mhm.
we see now with all of the books that are being banned, these are, although some of them are fiction, a lot of them are about history, and some
Yeah.
of them are autobiographical, which is about
Yeah.
someone else's history within the larger societal context. When
Hmm.
we are talking about books that are sci-fi, maybe those books will slide under the radar and because people will think, oh, well, that's made up, it's not really important.
Hmm.
And so then those books can act as subversive history lessons. But let me use this example. People are, well, no, let me be specific. White women are all up into The Handmaid's Tale.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, this could happen to me. This could happen to me. Oh my God. But then when you say, you know what? And the author has stated that part of what she took this from were the experiences that happened
Mhm.
to Black women in the United States of America and to some Native American women in the United States of America. And that is when you lose white women because they don't want to talk about that real historical happenings that we have receipts for. They don't want to go there. They want to stay with the work of fiction where they are the mainstream characters.
And there's a lot more control, I think. It's a different, like, because Handmaid also has a TV show that just ended a couple weeks ago. And some of the reactions to like the ending and the relationships in that show, I was like, oh, like y'all think this is like a love story. Like this is not a love story. And I think, yeah, like there's a little bit more control that they're able to kind of, it's like an avatar, right? Because like
Yeah.
June is in the story is she's the rebel. And it's like, but you could be rebelling in your real life. We need you to rebel in your real life. But
Right.
yeah, so I think that that's very, very real. I'm glad that you brought up that book and that story.
And
Um,
it's interesting that I was going to just
mhm.
say quickly about The Handmaid's Tale. There are a lot of messages embedded in that people just don't get. And and when I read narratives about it, those messages, especially about race, because there are a lot of messages about racism in
Right.
that
Yeah.
book.
Right.
But those don't surface. They don't get surface. There's a lot about gender. But
Hmm.
the messages about race, they are subtle. Sometimes
But
I
they're
think not
there.
so subtle, but they are there, and they don't get surfaced into the narrative and the reviews that I have read of The Handmaid's Tale.
And let me say this too, and where, how we all gravitate toward our points of societal oppression,
Of
then our
course,
points of societal privilege.
Hmm.
of
There
course.
are white women in The Handmaid's Tale who are the who operationalize and can keep going, keep oppression going. And it's
Hmm.
so interesting that, particularly white women, they don't talk about those characters. They don't put themselves, they don't align themselves with, they don't see themselves in or with those characters. They
Yeah.
see themselves with the white women who are oppressed characters. And so if you aren't even willing to make that leap or to have that understanding in the literature that you read, are you really going to make that leap and have that understanding in your real life, in your
Yeah.
vote, in your what you teach your children, in whatever,
I
in how
think,
you view history?
yeah, I think what's interesting is that, and this happens to me, I think a lot of the time with like stories, whether it be like books, TV shows, movies, most of us, I think, see ourselves as the hero. We like to put ourselves as the hero. I think it is extremely important that you always put yourself at least a little bit into the section of the villain. In The
Yes.
Handmaid's Tale,
Mhm.
there's June in the show, at least there's June, and then there's Serena, and I'm like, a lot of y'all, you might think that you're June, but a lot of us are actually Serena.
Mhm.
And I
Right.
think that we need to be honest about that. Like that you're actually not really the like
Yeah.
rebel who's like blowing stuff up, but like you might actually be the one who's like setting stuff up. And
You
so
you
what
absolutely
then?
can.
Like who are you then? And that's uncomfortable for you, for people.
Yeah.
You know, in my book, I have a character. His name is Donovan. He's Jamaican, and he is the person who betrays the Black cell, the people who are trying to come towards Black liberation. He betrays them, and people will read the book and they'll say, "That Donovan, I can't stand him. I hate him." And I absolutely love him. He's one of my favorite characters
Mm,
because there is so much of me in him.
Yeah.
There's so
okay.
much of my own growth and my own understanding of internalized racial inferiority, my own internalized racism that went into that character because I couldn't tell the story and tell the
Mm,
story as if everything and everybody was for Black liberation. I had to tell the story of those of us who have struggled with our own
yeah.
internalized racism, you know, and make him real. And
Mm.
people hate him. They hate him. I just can't. I just wish you could have just. Why did you even write him? I had to write him because he's an important part of the story.
Yeah.
And we like to pretend that we are not, that we do not come with the problematic parts of who we are that
Yeah.
continue to challenge even the movements that we say we're a part of. But we come with that, and it's got to be part of the narrative. It's got to be part of the story. And so I'm always fascinated when I say to people, "Well, I love him. He's me. You know, he's part of me." They're like, "That
Mm,
cannot be. You know, you do this work." No, really, no,
Mm.
really.
right.
And
No, I
although
mean,
I can't say I love Donovan, I can say that I don't hate Donovan
Right,
because our lives are filled with Donovans.
right.
yeah.
And one thing that I really appreciated about Donovan was the complexity with which you wrote him, that
Yeah.
you did not write him as a villain.
No.
And I agree. I could see myself in Donovan. I can see my growth journey in Donovan and the way in which you took every character on their growth journey. Right. That is one thing that's so fascinating about your book, Wendy, The Black Cell, is that nobody is, well, most are not.
Nobody's all good and all bad or all
Right.
bad. Yeah.
Nobody's all good, nobody's all bad. And that's one thing I find really fascinating and really helpful, and that I really love about Octavia E. Butler's books
Yes.
is that there is the character complexity. If
Yeah.
you look at the parable books, right?
Hmm.
And you look at, oh my God, I'm so blanking on her name.
Yeah. I was just trying to remember it too. It's an interesting name.
Help us out. What
Yeah,
is her
I am.
Her
Lauren?
name,
Lauren?
Lauren.
And
Hmm.
so she, was not the friendliest, most cuddly, most pure-hearted character.
Yeah.
She could be really off-putting sometimes, but
Yeah.
yet she had a humanity that
Right.
shone through her, wanting to survive. The
Hmm.
same thing with the character in Kindred,
Kindred. I was just thinking that Dana.
Yeah, she wants to
Dana,
survive.
Dana.
who
Hmm.
who was, I mean, she was
She had some
not
issues.
She
She's
had,
gonna have
yeah,
fun.
okay, that's a kind way of saying it. She really had issues, and she really did not connect with her history at all. And in fact, she thought she was a little bit above it. You know, we're in this time now, none of this applies now. And then she got transported back where she had to completely face her
Exactly.
history and her heritage and the
Exactly.
history of the country. So the complexity, not everybody has to be this person that you like in
That's right.
order for their
Ugh.
humanity to be acknowledged and respected. And I think that that's the
Mm.
most real thing at all about Octavia Butler's books. You don't have to like people to respect their humanity.
That's right.
And
And that's true in our work too, right?
yeah.
I feel like, Adar,
Whew.
you and I find ourselves in the anti-racism, anti-oppression training space, all a
Mm-hmm.
facilitation space all the time, right? We are facilitating these workshops for days and days and days, and we sit in spaces where people are really challenged by their privileged beliefs. And we've got to find a way in those moments to find, to be true, to share the truth of the history and the reality and the data, and do it with compassion and humanity, and really find the
Yeah.
person in the midst of the whatever it is that they're displaying. And sometimes it's pretty ugly.
Listen, the
Yeah.
fact that we are able to do that and to
Mm-hmm.
consistently do that with every single person that's coming into the space, even when they're insulting our humanity, our dignity, we
Often.
still offer a compassion and
Yeah.
care,
Yeah.
Right.
regardless of what the person is putting out to us.
I
Not
was just gonna
everybody can do that.
I was gonna say, I think, speaking of characters that we don't like, and that I think that like that uncomfortable element that when you're reading or watching something with someone, you're like, I cannot stand them. I'm like, maybe there's some connection that we don't like to always think about who we actually are in certain situations.
Mm.
And as someone else who does like ARAO training and trying to do this work, I think with as much compassion and grace, I also remember when I got into this work, and because people see me now and I'm like, no, 5, 10, 20 years ago, that was not me. Like, I think for me, characters like Donovan or leads that we don't like remind me that like there's always a starting place and
Yeah.
we don't come fully formed.
Yes.
And that also this work is difficult and we have to have grace for other people and for ourselves, but we have to have honesty. Like grace does not mean that there's not honesty involved.
That's
And
right.
that's something I think that Butler's work reminds me that there's so much to making change in the world and that it's not just like I gave a great speech and I did XYZ and then it was over. It's like you have to work through your own stuff. And I think watching people do that or reading people do that is something that's really, really beautiful. I did want to ask a question because you brought up Adar about not seeing Butler kind of like making her like a magical Negro in a way. And so actually, part of the reason that she talked about in this essay is that someone had asked her, well, how did you see the future? And to
Mhm.
her, she just said, well, I looked at the issues that we ignored and I gave it about 10, 20, 30 years. And that's how, I really came up with these kind of stories. And so you also brought up some information just about history and how we kind of, deal with history in this country. Um, Butler talks about looking at history is an essential part to predicting or understanding the shaping of the future. What histories do you think are most urgent for communities to remember right now? Are there any kind of stories that you think should be uplifted? I think especially in this current moment.
Let Adar go first this time.
Yeah.
I knew you were going to say that at some point. Um, so I think a friend of mine who is a panelist who joins us sometimes, Rasheen, says everything is local, start where
Mhm.
you are. And I think that we can start with our families. What are their stories, and how were their stories within the societal conditions at a time, at this, at any time, at the time that they were growing up? Those who know me know that I've been doing genealogical research since I was like 14 years old. When I had to schlep down to the Library of Congress and use microfiche, and ride the
Wow.
bus and all of that. But I've collected oral histories. I was the nosy kid that always wanted to sit into the adult conversation, and the information that I gathered has stood me in good stead, particularly the older that I've gotten, because it helped me understand a lot of things. So our family stories are really important, and people tend to want to whitewash the family stories, and
Yeah.
particularly white people in the United States of America. And I'm not picking on white people. I'm saying white people within the context of historical whiteness practices, right? So it's you only go like a generation or two generations back, and somebody's grandmother, great grandmother, great grandfather might be involved with the Klan, might have seen a lynching and picnicked around it, might have been part of denying a loan to Black families in their community, whatever, or might have been that person who helped, a person, right? Might have been the person who befriended a person. So our unwhitewashed family histories helps us contextualize ourselves and our role in it, and it also helps us contextualize our communities. So that local connection, what were our communities like? What environment did our parents, grandparents, great grandparents grow up in? That local connection and understanding is really, really important, and it helps people understand why we are as we are today.
Yes.
And I also think an understanding of the foundational documents, a real unwhitewashed understanding of the foundational documents of the United States. On
Mhm.
social media, a person was saying to me, we fought for, this land of the free and home of the brave. And I'm like, look, who is this we to which you refer? And, because none of that included me and mine. And she
Mm,
wanted to fight me up and down that, of course, it included everybody. And so, Wendy, you had talked about the United States being very ahistorical, and it's not
yeah.
only ahistorical, it is ignorant, particularly around issues of racism and how whiteness as a political and social and economic system developed. Because
Right.
we always want to stay with but that's not the America I grew up in. Well, yes, it is.
It's very
So
real.
it's very real. So our really having an understanding of that, and particularly in this moment when avenues for understanding all of that are being truncated, cut off, or downright criminalized.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. I think what you're saying is, and we're seeing that, I think that discussion very, very much happening right now around like what this country is, right? Like,
Yeah.
we're constantly, I believe, I forgot what their name is, but they were talking about, the fight that we're seeing right now is a fight for memory about like
Oh,
what this
yes.
country actually is, the history
Yeah.
of it,
Yeah.
our family's history,
Yeah.
and that kind of uncomfortable like reality that it's like it's not all one thing. Like none of us are all one thing. I can't expect our country and the history of our country to be all one thing. And being able, I think, to sit with all of it is it's very uncomfortable and hard for people. And I also think that it's a lot easier to just let it go and be like, well, we don't have to worry about it anymore, even though it's shaped so much of, who we are and how we operate. And so I really kind of want to like ask the next question about how do you, using that kind of historical memory and the ancestral knowledge, how do you use that to push your work, and how can others possibly do the same? You or Wendy can both, answer that.
Can I take that first, Wendy?
You
Go
got
Only
ahead.
it.
Go
because
ahead,
I'm looking at
Adar.
only
Wendy's
because
not
I'm
going to
looking
argue
at
Because
a
you're
with me.
comment.
volunteering, I'm not going to argue with you.
I'm looking at a comment that is so instructive. Um, and thank you for bringing this up. I don't know who 71 pan is. But this person was saying the bootstrap myth. No, oh no, not the bootstrap myth. Wait a minute. I think it was the comment before that. Yes, yes. Lenny, I think I was brought up with the bootstrap myth. Through my
Mhm.
research, I learned that generation after generation were early settlers on indigenous land from east to west. And I love this comment because it really illustrates the whitewashing that we're taught. And it
Mhm.
illustrates the power of the narrative of framing and who has that power,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Because if I were going to talk about that, I would talk about the colonizers
Mm.
as opposed to settlers, right?
Mm.
And I would talk about colonizers because a lot of Native Americans
Yeah.
frame it as colonization.
Mhm.
When we frame it as settler, or this is a settler nation, whose
Yeah.
story are we really telling and whose framing are we really telling? And yes, so Lenny says it's settler colonization. That
Mhm.
still sounds like a very whitewashed thing. I mean, that has a different resonance than somebody is colonizing. The
Mhm.
settler colonization to me doesn't really emphasize the violence of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It doesn't emphasize what was lost in it. It doesn't emphasize the genocide of it. It really emphasizes the hopes and wants and dreams of those settlers who came here to settle, you know, peacefully or just to get a piece of a pie for free land. Whereas
Yeah.
colonizer really brings the weight of the violence and the loss that happened.
Yeah, it's a
So
different starting point. It's like you
it's
start either with the violence of who was here and what happened to them, or you're starting with like who settles and then what happens, right? So
right.
yeah.
So to answer your question, Julia, one of the important things that I do in my work is really to help frame from a historical perspective that centers the marginalized or the people who were marginalized, the people who suffered that violence, the people who lost history, land, customs,
Yeah.
the framing of the work which centers them as opposed to the framing of the work which centers whiteness and the mythology that America tells about itself is an important historical
Yeah.
centering that I use for the work. Okay, Wendy, what about you?
Well, I agree with all of that. And Adar, what you had me thinking about was all of these Western stories that, the narrative about, the wagon trails and the how difficult it was. And there might be a blip in there about some Native American people, who were, mostly they were like scalping the white folks, that
Yeah.
was the narrative. There might be a little blip about that, but then the rest of the story is all about these people who came and worked so hard and how tough life was, and how they had to struggle to get, to survive. And it's just interesting, the balance or the imbalance of that story. So anyway, you
Mhm.
made me think of that. One of the things that I am really just I'm spending a lot of time thinking and talking about this bag of goods we have been sold, about the progress, the racial progress we have made in this country.
Yeah.
I mean, we really have, and I'm telling you that people of all races have bought this stuff. It's almost as if whatever we are seeing is not real. We're not really seeing it. That's happening in a dream somewhere. And over here, we've got these hopes and we've got these wishes. And I think she says, Octavia Butler says something about, wishes being, not changing society, right? But we
Right.
we have sort of bought this bag of goods that says that we as a country, as a society, we have changed, we have progressed. Look, we had a black president. Well, let's get into that for a minute, right? We had a black president who would not have been elected had he been fully black.
Mhm.
He's biracial. So he had enough whiteness in him to make him acceptable, right? And nothing has significantly changed since his election. We
Yeah.
are, if that were the case, we would not be in this point in 2025 watching a rollback of everything that we thought we gained in the civil rights movement, right? Like we would not be there. We wouldn't, this would not be able to happen in what, 100 days of a particular person being elected. No, because had we really made the gains we said we made in this society, every single person in the society would have, first of all, we wouldn't have the president we have today. We wouldn't, people would not have seen, what does she call it? She talks about the seduction and the, what's the other word she used? The bludgeon and the seduction
And
of the
mhm,
dictatorship, right? That
mhm.
that wouldn't have been able to happen. But yet we continue to go around talking about this progress we have made in this country as if it were truly transformative and not mostly symbolic.
Right.
And so part of my focus when we talk about history is to keep bringing it back to this is symbolism, people. We have been willing
Yes.
to accept symbolism in the place of transformation because it felt good and because we wanted to and because it was a dream for us to be able to say that as a country we are post-racial. Right.
Yeah.
We ain't post-racial, y'all. Like for real, we have bought this and we have passed this narrative down to our children. And so therefore our children, the next generations beyond those of us, well, me and Adar, Julia, you're younger than us. The next generations beyond us are really feeling like, but that's not a thing. Like we didn't really go through all of that. That is the beginning of the end, y'all. Like when our next generation they don't know the history, how
Yeah.
are they possibly going to be prepared to fight and to move this society forward if they don't even know where we're standing right now because they don't know where we've been? But we have
Yeah.
bought this, right? We've bought this. And I hear this narrative over and over again. I hear Black people talking about, well, we've come so far. Have we really, y'all?
I think it's interesting though. I think because on one end, I remember growing up and learning history in school and being like, oh, okay, so like it was really bad for Black people. And this was obviously even before we got Obama. I was like, okay, well, it's better now. Like, I don't have to worry about that. Only to get into my late 30s and be like, oh, dang, I
Oh, wait
mean,
a
we still
minute.
got to fight. We still got to do this. But because I had people, my parents, that you talk about, talking to
Telling you.
your family
That's
about
right.
like their history,
Right.
about growing up, because I love to read. So reading those histories,
That's right.
engaging with people in community about those histories, it lets you know that like how symbolism is extremely powerful.
Oh, seductive.
It is right, but it is not actual change. It's not material change. And I think that that's when when I talk about ignorance is bliss, every single day, the older I get, I'm like, oh, I really know what that means now because knowing is so much, it's hard because you can't ignore. And it also, I think it forces me at least to be a lot more honest about what am I willing to put forth in order to like get the change that we need. It allows me to be honest with myself. And so I think, yeah, like that's a very real thing about like how history it's a story, right? Like, it's a part of storytelling. Who's telling the story? Who
Exactly.
gets to tell the story? Who gets to be the good guy in the story? Who gets to be the
Right.
bad guy? That's all set
That's
before
right.
you even really kind of recognize like, oh, this is actually like real life. And this has real impacts.
That's right.
That
You
kind
know,
of go ahead, Adar.
no, I'm just seeing this. I've seen this 71 pan refer to cash payment reparations for American freedmen of chattel slavery. So there's clearly a theme going with this person.
Mm-hmm.
um, but the first part of this question, how does storytelling among non-Black Americans move the conversation forward
Mm.
and advocate for reparations, which I want to address.
Oh yeah,
Mm.
please
And,
do.
and
Yeah,
this
it's a
is
good
where
question.
I think that both the historical storytelling of Octavia Butler and of Wendy, that it helps with that is again the historical piece.
Mm-hmm.
The ways in which storytelling does not allow things to be whitewashed, because it takes a small number of people to be able to say, we want this in order for this to happen. And again, we go back to the civil rights movement, less than 25% of the population supported it. But yet, because the United States, the Congress was afraid that things would just blow the roof off, they decided that to give some things was better than giving nothing, and it would save that. So
That's right.
if white people, you know, knew of the history and started to advocate around this, it wouldn't take 50% of the population. It would just take some white people saying, this is important, just as we were for reparations for Japanese Americans who went through internment camps. Just as we were for reparations for some Native American tribes. I do a whole workshop on reparations with like 5 slides of the receipts of which groups have received cash reparations from the United States, and only one group has not, and that is African American. And just the court case for the families who lost everything in the Tulsa
yeah, Black Wall Street.
pogrom, right? And they, again, reparations was voted down for them, and they can't bring the case again. So all of the conversation about, well, nobody who lived now was born enslaved, and nobody who lived now was there at that time. Well, there are people who are living now who this happened to and who were there as perpetrators, and they still voted not to do reparations. And now,
Maryland, can we talk about Maryland? Can we
no,
talk
wait
about
a minute, wait,
see,
even
I
before we
wasn't
get
gonna bring
there,
it
wait,
up.
let's not go to Maryland yet, because now a Black politician has said, yes, I am going to make reparations, but I'm going to make it in the form of an infrastructure bill on the North End where a lot of African Americans still live. And he calls it reparations. No, that's not reparations. So we need, I bet that had white people there been saying, yes, here are people who were alive, they lost everything, they lived their whole lives in the shadow of this, we need to do something, that might have garnered a different outcome. And so, okay, yes, we can go to Maryland now.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean,
who was surprised to learn that
they're,
voted down reparations in our state?
I think that this is not, we're still talking about Octavia Butler and
yes, we are talking about
her.
Yes.
But I also think it's interesting because when we talk about that kind of that discomfort, like I remember when Obama won, it was like, yes, like finally, only I think to get older and be like, oh wait, like not much has changed. And what does that mean? What does it mean to have a symbol? If they're, especially if they're going to do the same thing that everybody before them was already doing. And so I think that the decision with Westmore, his decision is, we can talk around it. We can say it's about like this moment because what's happening politically in the bridge, and he has to make sure. But I also think there's a gutlessness about it that I'm just like, we weren't even talking necessarily about like giving direct money. We were talking about doing research on it. And
Yes.
that's
we can't even research it.
It's like we weren't even talking about like, hey, we cutting checks on Tuesday. We're talking about we want to do historical kind of research and talking about it, and that was shut down. And I was like, to me, that already says what it is.
Yes.
And what I'm supposed to expect going forward. And that is deeply it's saddening and maddening, and that's all I can say about that. But yeah, that is where we are.
Yeah. And I am, again, a comment, young Black Americans are ready for this. Listen, older Black Americans are ready for this. And we've been the ones who've been in a struggle for this. So this is, one of the things that I love about Octavia Butler, again, was that things are intergenerational.
Yep,
She
that's what I was about to
respects
go
the
to.
fact
Yeah.
that all movements don't just start with the generation who is the young generation at
Right.
whatever time. She
That's right.
respects the fact that generations prior to that and generations prior to those generations have done the work. There have always been people doing the work, and there have always been people who have been in opposition to the work. No one generation has a lock on readiness or
Mhm.
willingness. And part
Right.
of the tragedy of our not knowing our history is that people don't seem to really understand the intergenerational connection,
That's
nor
right.
want to respect it,
That's
nor
right.
want to work intergenerationally. And one thing about Octavia Butler's books, all of her books,
Mhm.
that intergenerational connection was front and center.
Critical.
And in your book,
Mhm.
Wendy, The Black Cell, even down to the cover,
Yep,
the
it is.
sense of generational and intergenerational connection
Yeah.
was there. The
Yeah. Yeah.
sense of respecting the space
That's right.
was there. The
Mhm.
sense of knowing, what to put forth when, how to respect what was going on in a given space was there. And I think to get back to a prior question that you had, Julia, of what we could do in the space and where we are now, learning
Mhm.
about that connection, figuring out whether how we're showing up is respecting a space or not,
That's
whether
right.
it is advancing the collective or just advancing whatever your agenda you're bringing into the room, and
That's right.
the individualism of United States society, and particular the individualism of whiteness practice, is something that is antithetical to um, Black and indigenous people and the space that we're in. And that just
Yeah.
feels so disrespectful when it happens.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah. Go ahead, Wendy.
I know I agree with you so much, Adar. And
Mhm.
the reality is that, look, we are not going to move our society forward unless everybody's at the table. We can't afford to leave anybody out, right? So there
Mhm.
are groups of people who are sort of movement building and doing this work, and they seem to think it's all about the young people. And then there are other people who are like, it's all about the old people. And look, the reality is that the young people have creativity and energy, and they're going to carry the work forward, but they don't have necessarily the wisdom and the experience that they need to get from the
Mhm.
previous generations. And we know that there's a lot of ancestral knowledge that is available to us if we tap into it, right? Like if we decide to tap into that ancestral knowledge. So there's multiple generations of people, some living and some gone on already, who are all going to be part of this movement. And the minute we start thinking that it's me or it's my generation, or I don't have to worry about it because I'm too old and it's that generation, that new generation, we're already doomed because we can't make this work if everybody's not at
Right.
the table.
I was gonna say I think that one of the beautiful things about Butler's work, and also I think like even in the Black Cell, is that like there is this kind of communal like discussion,
Very
right? Like their
much.
like
Very
community
much.
is at the center of a lot of movement work.
Yes.
Very rarely, and this is I think spans most sci-fi stories, is it just like really one person. If it is like one lead person, it's like they're usually going through like a quest with other people
A
who
host of
give them
people. Yeah.
knowledge, right? Who lead and pass things down to them.
Mhm.
And so I think that this makes me kind of question, how do we have, I think especially now, we were talking about social media before we kind of started. I think in this kind of social media age, there's a lot of, you see a lot more kind of individual kind of like, well, this is me. This is what I'm doing. It is what we should be doing, but I'm going to be doing this on my own. How do we bring and bridge those gaps between young and old, between folks, who are just starting, who don't know, and those who have always been and been like, this is what I'm about. How do we bring people into these spaces, do you think?
Oh,
I
that's a
think
tough one.
people, yeah, well, I
And
think that a lot of people younger people are coming into these spaces because it is in their self-interest to do so.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that that one thing that people who've been in these spaces for God knows how long, you know, can do is to continue to nurture that. And I
Yeah.
can tell you that in my own practice, and hermit that I am, you know, I'm still, when there are younger people in a space, I'm reaching out, I'm checking in, I'm, you know, scheduling lunch, and y'all know I don't like to eat it when I don't know whose hand is on the food, but I'm going to do, you know, what I can to try to relationship develop. And the reality is that there are so few spaces where younger people can have access to just sit down and just talk and to be
Yeah.
listened to and heard. And anybody for that matter, you know,
Like a
because
third
nobody
space.
feels that they are listened to. Nobody feels that they are heard.
Right.
So to connect with people where you know that they are interested in you
Yeah.
and interested in getting to know you, and you don't have to show up in any other way other than as you are. So I think that the last thing I'll say on that is that unlike in many white communities where eldership is not a thing, elder isn't a thing, you just get older and then you just go someplace and die because you're no longer useful. In Black communities and some other communities of color, the concept of being an elder is a thing. And there
Yes.
are
Very much.
expectations around being an elder and how you show up. And to
Right.
be able to live in those expectations. I've had people who in my circle of friends who consider me an elder, who I mean, like, step to me if they feel like I'm not showing up, like, you missed that moment because this person was reaching out to you and blah, 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 and you need to go and make that right. And then I do. And I love the concept of that type of accountability. And it also frees me to say to them, okay, you know, let's talk this out
Yeah.
because the way that this happened was not good. And I know that they will listen to me because there is trust built there, a relationship built there, and they know that I care enough or more or as much about what happens to them as I care about what happens to my 14-year-old love of my life niece. And so it is that trust there that continues to keep people coming back. And I think just our nurturing those type of circles and relationships.
I think I agree with you absolutely, Dar. I think though some of those situations don't happen organically. And so sometimes we have to make them happen. I remember I was interviewing some people for a book I'm working on, and they were talking about this was a group out of Seattle, and they were talking about a lot of organizing they were doing in the 1980s around education, and they talked about a day where they pulled all the kids out of school, and they set up all these different spaces, you know, by race. And so, you know, the Native American elders were in a space, and they brought all the children, and they said they had 5-year-olds sitting there for 5 hours listening to the stories of the elders, right? And think about how powerful that is. And then there were Asian American spaces where, you know, there was the storytelling and the sharing of culture. I think that in this age of social media, that's not as organic as it used to be when we
Absolutely.
lived more communally. I think so that means then that we are going to have to be intentional about sharing that. And look, the reality is that white people and white ancestors have a lot to share with younger white people, right? And so there is sometimes, I think, a missed opportunity for white people to tap into the struggles of their ancestors, the struggles. You know, my mentor always says, white people need to sit down and talk about their struggles. Like, there are a lot of Europeans who went through a lot of struggles, and the younger generation have lost contact with that, right?
Yes.
They've not tapped into the struggles of their ancestors. So look, if you can't tap into the struggles of your own ancestors, how are you going to understand mine?
I want to say this is funny because, like, obviously, I'm not sure if people have seen the movie Sinners yet, but I remember like during the discussion of the movie, the vampire in the film is Irish, and people were like, "Oh, well, like." I said, white people have ancestors, y'all. I'm like,
Absolutely.
and they have so many stories that like they themselves could learn from, but like I think that we could also learn.
Absolutely.
I thought that the decision to make the vampire Irish was very smart. And it made him very layered for like how he approaches, the situation of trying to like change people in the movie. But I think that it's one of those things where um I think that there's also the reality that for some people, those stories become a discomfort because who they think that themselves to be, or who they've been telling
Mm,
themselves that they are, that doesn't actually match up with the history or the stories that their family members are going to tell. And so I think that but the reality is, and if there's one lesson I want people to walk away with this kind of conversation is like that has to be okay. Like that has to be a part of the learning and the lesson. That like all the stories you hear are not going to be good stories, and they're going to make you uncomfortable. They're going to like history like they're not supposed to just be easy breezy. And you don't learn the lesson, without some
yeah,
hardship. And so
yeah.
it's really important. I think that yeah, that like that's something that people think about and maybe put into practice. Talk to your family members. Y'all going out on a Saturday, ask them some stuff over dinner. Like, so what was it
Mm,
like? I'm in the middle right now with my father, who's in his 70s, like asking him questions that I've always kind of been afraid to ask. Like, because I've been afraid of the answer. But I've already lost my mom, so I have to ask him these questions, or I'll never know. And so I think it's really important that all of us kind of put some. That is a place I think we can all start. To kind of ask those around us.
mm,
I know that we've talked a lot about Octavia and gotten into history and the importance of kind of intergenerational connections and community building. But I did want to get a little bit before we start to kind of wind down about Butler herself. Um, Butler in a lot of ways she was almost somewhat private. Like she kind of had this very rich internal kind of interior life. And she did deal with some things that she was necessarily not always like comfortable with, whether it be her
mm,
body. I think, Adar was talking about her being like too tall or too black. And she was pretty introverted. And so she is somebody who was doing a lot of, I think, just kind of inner work and putting that in her stories. Um,
Mm.
what, as Octavia Butler fans, how does her life speak to you? Right, 'cause I know for me as a black girl who has always been like bigger and kind of had a very like always in my own kind of brain at times. To me, she is kind of a beacon for like that is also very powerful.
mm,
Even if you're not always like happy or if you're uncomfortable. But what does her life speak to you?
mhm. I think for many of us as writers, we have this external persona, and then we have this internal life.
Mhm.
And whether it is um, through envisioning a better world or seeing ourselves and our characters, there is there is a different way of experiencing the world when you write. I think when you create art of any type, right? I think
Yeah.
there's a different way of experiencing the world that allows you to see the world either, the way you want it to be, or in maybe not in ways you don't want it to be, but in changing um, the way you see the world. And I know that when I write, I leave my body, I leave who I am, and I
Mm.
become somebody else for a moment, for a while. And I wonder whether Octavia Butler experienced the world like that, as the world was challenging to her. But when you sit to write, you get to create a
Mm.
whole different world, and you get to be in that world in some way that if you're the narrator, you have some power. You can make characters do things. You can stop characters from doing things. You can there's a different life that I find, this is just my experience as a writer, that you can step into when you are narrating a story that takes you out of the day-to-day things. And I just wonder whether that was part of her experience also.
Yeah. Yeah, that's deep. That's
I,
beautiful.
you know, I feel that as a reader too, Wendy. I mean, I can sit with a book, on some weekends and I can like start at 9 and then I come up for air and it's 5 or 6. And
Mhm.
I have absolutely no idea how that much time passed because I wasn't even like here. I was in the book. And I remember reading this from her a long time ago, and so I had to pull this up now because this quote is everything. She said, "Every story I write adds to me a little,
Mm,
changes me a little,
mhm,
forces me to re-examine an attitude or belief, causes me to research and learn, helps me to understand people and grow." And that is how I feel as a reader about
Same,
books.
mm,
Um, yeah,
mm,
there is nothing like it. And then when you have a writer who is an intelligent writer, who
mm,
is a writer that is very attuned to history, who has that emotional intelligence that can be conveyed. And then just going
yeah,
to a question in the chat from Rajani,
yeah,
thoughts
I was about
about
to.
what we can learn from the multiracial, multigender
Mhm.
communities. This for me, Rajani, is her Afrofuturism
yes,
coming full force into the room. Because if you notice in many of her books, especially with the Patternist series, and with Bloodchild, she creates a whole new world where she is dealing with oppression and privilege in ways that have absolutely nothing to do with the ways in which we experience those things. So
Mhm.
it we can let that go and open up our mind and see these things in different ways. We can see what is possible, even in the parable series books, that's
Yes,
very
yeah,
much rooted
definitely.
in the United States. We see what is possible when you have a community that is multiracial, that is multigendered, where she, emphasizes queer as being so quote unquote normal that it's
normal.
not even worth making a real plot point about it. It is just something that is. It
Mm,
is like the air that the characters are breathing. It is like someone who is straight cisgender. It is.
that's right.
And it is with fullness and richness. And so the way in which she gives us choices and opportunities to look at it in this very much rooted in this realm that we're in, or for
Yes.
us to go into other realms that have nothing to do with this realm and maybe turn these issues around a little bit differently for ourselves. And as she
Mhm,
says, the opportunity to re-examine our
that's right.
attitudes, beliefs, and to learn
That's
and to
right.
grow.
Yes.
It's
Yeah.
Afro pessimism and Afro optimism. It's
Yeah, I
about
think,
there's a lot of optimism in that work, right? That
yeah,
this is what the world could look like.
I think what I was just gonna also like, kind of answer some of that question for me. And I think it's that quote is so perfect. A lot of it reminds like I'm not the only one who has to do the work
Yeah,
and that needs to be doing the work and that has an answer.
yeah.
And that like I think that it's very hard in a society and a culture where individualism is kind of touted as like the top thing, the best thing.
Mhm.
And the reality is that in order for us to really make actual moves, we need each other. And that can sometimes, I think, for some people sound very
Yeah.
kumbaya, but like y'all, sometimes community is an inconvenience, but like it's a It's the inconvenience that we sometimes need. I will never forget, we
Absolutely.
were in a BRJA meeting and Adar was like, we have to get everybody's input. And I was like, this is taking so long. Oh my gosh. But I remember also thinking like, but this is actually the kind of work that we say we want. Like this is us
Right.
practicing
That's right.
what it's supposed to
Right.
look like.
It is inconvenient.
It is inconvenient. And I think
Community is inconvenient.
sometimes like
Yes.
it's so important to remember that. Like, there are people in communities who have a completely different historical relationship with this
Mhm.
country. And like it is inconvenient that sometimes I have to slow down to explain and listen, but that's the reality, right? Like, and so I think that for me, it's about like remembering like the inconvenience is also kind of a gift. Like it's it's not always the best gift, but it's a gift that we have to have in order to move with everybody. Like if we actually want to move with everybody. That's the reality for me. And that's where her books continue to kind of remind me as I get older.
Because we can't leave anybody behind. That's
We
right.
can't, yeah, it's like, not everybody's gonna go, but
That's right.
those who say they want to go,
That
like
we have to give them an
we
opportunity.
got to give them opportunity. We got to make space for them. And that's not always fun. That's the inconvenience.
Yeah. Yeah.
And as we're kind of wrapping up, because we're at 7:30, I did want to
Yep.
ask one last question before we go into like our next kind of, how you can join BRJA and get involved. Um, she closes, this essay, with warnings and possibilities. If you could add another rule for the future from your own experience,
Mm.
what would it
Mm.
be?
A good one.
For
Mm.
me, I take my inspiration from this from Lauren. And one thing that I really admired and admire about her is that she continued to keep going
Mm.
Mm,
no matter what, even when the most devastating thing happened to her. When I mean the betrayal of her brother and the loss of her daughter when he knew where her daughter was, she kept going. She always did, and she always prioritized the collective, her vision for collectivity over her individual wants, hurts, pains. And not that she didn't address them, she healed through that, through community. She healed through continuing with the cause. And in a lot of Octavia Butler's books, her characters, they adapt.
yeah.
Yeah.
They adapt and they
Yeah.
continue to grow and go. So my additional rule would be to continue to adapt, continue to grow, and continue to go.
Okay. Continue
Oh,
to
I
go.
like that. I think I would go back to something we were talking about earlier, and I think it would be prepared to embrace the messiness and the imperfection of the process.
Mm,
Because we are going to be challenged along the way. We are going to mess something up along the way. We have to have a lot of self-compassion and self-forgiveness that we can then share with other people, because this is not a straight path. It is never
right.
going to be a linear path. It's going to be a curving, difficult switchbacks, and you're going, I think we all find ourselves in a learning space where we say, "Boy, did I really do that? Did I really say that? Did I really go there? Did I?
Mhm.
Wow, I thought I was beyond that." Well, it's messy. This work is
Yeah.
messy, and we have got to be able to acknowledge, the gains when we get them. And I think about Dana in Kindred, who was just about there's a whole lot of messiness in who she was, and just kind of like there were moments when it seemed like, okay, she's really got this, and there were moments when I was like, okay,
But
she ain't got that
no.
at all, right? And that's part of the process, I think, for all
Right.
in our growth and our evolution and
Yeah.
building our analysis.
Yeah, I would say my rule would be remember that you are not an exception to the lesson. I think that
Yes.
sometimes in these spaces, and I am also guilty of this, having knowledge is a very beautiful and powerful thing, but it is also, a lot of responsibility. And sometimes we're so busy teaching others that we forget that we also have to remember the lesson. We're not an exception to it just because we understand it. And you know, we have to constantly be like, oh no, like be honest with yourself. Like I remember when I didn't know. I remember when I was saying stuff that was like considered cancelable, and you know, it was like, and you know what? And I learned, and I'm doing better. And so I think that you have got to, you know, remember that you're not an exception to the things that you're saying out your mouth, the lessons
Yeah.
you're trying to impart on others. And I think that sometimes social media makes it a little bit easier for us to do that. But in real life, like y'all, we got to have a little bit more grace and
Yeah.
patience with
Can I,
ourselves.
if I can add one more, and this gets back
Sure.
to Rajani's question about the multiracial stuff. Be respectful when you're in other people's spaces,
Mm,
you know, because you're there as a guest. And so just be respectful, because it is so disrespectful how people show up sometimes.
mm,
And it is the fastest way that one can show themselves, not as an ally, not as an accomplice, but just as somebody with an agenda.
yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
so that is
That a lot.
so important. And I think that we miss that cue, and we
Mhm.
miss that lesson
Yeah.
often. And that is one thing that ruptures multiracial relationships.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, we could honestly probably talk more about Octavia Butler and all the other people that she's inspired, the stories and books she's inspired, but also I think the lessons that she brings forth, particularly in our kind of in our world right now. But we're gonna like to start to wrap up. I want to thank Adar and Wendy for this really beautiful, just like conversation. There were times I was like, honestly, I can listen to y'all talk and just, you know, gain so much information and knowledge. So I want to thank you for taking this time on this wonderful kind of rainy, I think, Friday, and sharing just kind of your own stories and wisdom and lifting up Octavia Butler's work and how we can use it going forward. Certainly, I'm going to ask Dana just to share our last few slides. And all right. So just I hope that folks are, of course, connected to BRJA, whether that be on our website. I know we have something on Eventbrite, our newsletter, so you can take BRJA with you in July. Check out the BRJA Buzz in our social media posts for news about our 13th of the month events and summer learning opportunities. And we'll be back in August for our in-person event. And that's the location is to be determined, but please look out for emails and social media to find out where that is. And next up, we have BRJA and Friends, realizing the full potential of fiscal sponsorship. That's going to be happening on Thursday, June 26th from 2 to 3:30. It's going to be virtual and it
Yes.
is free or donation based. We hope that you're able to join and learn more. And we also invite folks to help us build conversation education like this by becoming a monthly sustainer. So you can use this QR code to donate so we can support events like these, our virtual and online spaces, as well as the work we're doing out in the community for other organizations, both locally and nationally. So I want to thank you all for joining this wonderful Friday 13th. I hope that once you kind of, you know, hang up here, maybe you go, maybe you have a book you're reading, maybe it's an Octavia Butler book, and you can engage with that and maybe think about some of the things that we discussed this evening. But thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your Friday.
Thank you all. Thank you for the
Thank you.
opportunity. I really enjoyed it. Thanks.